In this lesson, we'll continue with our friends at Snug as a Bug, building this real estate website. I want you to start by opening the lesson files that are in your Lesson 3 folder. You'll find them by choosing File, Open Site on your desktop, in Project Files, in Lesson 3, choose Snug as a Bug, Open. For the most part, this site should look like it did at the end of Lesson 2. It has our main page master and our who.aspx page. But it also has a couple of other things that I added. One of them is this web config file. That's there to help ensure that these files will work properly on your computer just as they do on mine. The other new addition to this is the app data folder. This folder has the actual database files that we'll be working with starting in this lesson. So even if you think you did Lesson 2 perfectly, please open the version of the site that's in Lesson 3 to make sure you have everything you need to move forward from here. Let's start by creating another new page from our master page. Choose File, New, Create from Master Page. Again, we're going to browse for the master page. Click OK. And remember, the first thing you need to do before you can add anything to this page is select your main content area and click on the Create Custom Content link. That's what enables you to add content to this main area. Let's also go ahead and save this file. I'm going to call this agents.aspx because this will be our main agents page. Make sure you name these files exactly as I do as we go along so that the links we've already set will work when we go to test these pages. Before you can start adding data from a data source to a web page like this, you first have to establish a connection to that data source. You can do so in a couple of ways. One of them is to use the Toolbox task pane. By the way, if you don't have this open because we did close it at the end of the last lesson, you'll find it under Task Panes when you choose Toolbox. You also have the option of resetting the workspace layout if you ever want to get back to the original settings of the program. For the most part, I'll be using the default workspace layout all the way through this series. If you're in the Toolbox, you want to scroll down to ASP.NET Controls. You can open and close elements like this by clicking on the little icon next to them. Under the ASP.NET Controls, you'll find a section labeled Data. And this is where you'll find the data source connection controls. So if you're working with an Access database, you'd want the Access data source. If you're working with XML files, you'd choose the XML data source. We're working with SQL, so this is the option you'd want. When you establish your initial connection, you also have the choice of using the data source library. Again, if it's not open, you'll find it under the Task Pane menu. I like this option because in this task pane, you can also see a list of any connections that may already be established. And you can set up more than one database connection within a page or an ASP.NET site. To create a new connection, you would click on the link, and in the Data Source dialog, you would select the kind of data connection you're going to make. For this site, we're going to connect to a SQL Server Express database file that has been exported from a database. We'll use that technique in part because it was easier to provide the database file than to include the actual database in the files in this training video. But both options work similarly for most of what we'll do in this series. Let me just show you one thing that is different during the connection process. So if I choose SQL Server instead of SQL Database File, the first difference is that I'll have two options under Data Provider, SQL Server or OLE. Your choice should depend on how your system is set up, but I wanted you to see you do have that option. When you click OK, you'll get to the Connection Properties dialog. In theory, you should be able to click the refresh button and Expression Web should find any data sources available on your system. In practice, I haven't always gotten this to work. So here's a tip. If you're working with Microsoft SQL Server Express and you installed it on your system with the default setting, as I recommended in the first lesson of this training, then your server name would look like this. Localhost / SQL Express. That's the default location for a SQL Server Express database. If you know that you've got a database in a different location on your system, you would simply type the address in here. Next, you want to specify authentication options. If you're running all of this locally, which is what I recommend for development and testing, then the Windows authentication option is fine. Essentially, you're just logging into the server as you connect. If you're working on a remote server at a commercial ISP or at your university or company, you'll probably have to use SQL Server authentication, and you'll need to get that login information from your service provider or your site administrator. Under the Connect to a Database option, you can use the arrow to find the available option. If you've established a connection properly, you should be able to choose the database from here. If not, you can type in the database name yourself. Also notice that you have an Advanced button here at the bottom. Initialization, security, you'll find these kinds of settings under the Advanced option. Once you get all of the settings the way you want, you simply click OK. And you even have the option to test your connection before you're done. I'm going to cancel at this point because I'm going to establish a connection to our data file. But I wanted you to see how it was different if you're connecting to an actual database. To keep things simpler in this series, we're going to be working with a data file that was exported from SQL Server Express. So let's do this again and actually establish the connection to our database files. Choose New Connection. This time we'll choose Database File. Notice now there's only one option, so that's an easy choice. Click OK. And here you have a much simpler dialog. I want you to browse. And now we're going to find this database file, but let's make sure you're in the right place. So you want to make sure you're on the desktop, in Project Files, in Lesson 3, in this version of the website, Snug as a Bug, and we're inside the app_data folder. You want to open that, and you'll find Snug as a Bug MDF. That's the file you want to connect to. Select it and choose Open. Windows authentication is just fine for what we're doing here. And if you want to make sure it worked, you can test the connection. It succeeded for me. I hope it worked for you. If not, go back and make sure you're selecting this from the right place on your system and that you have the right version of the site, the one in your Lesson 3 folder, open in Expression Web. Click OK. And now you see the name of this connection is called Connection String 1. You can change that name if you choose to, but I'm going to leave it at the default Connection String 1. And we'll be using this over and over throughout the series. This is how you establish this initial connection that we'll use each time we bring data into these pages. OK. And now you can see in our data source library the connection listed.